Thunder grumbled beyond the sapphire crest while the dining room glittered with money and perfume. Lila Harper slid between tables with a practiced smile, a tray steady over her shoulder. A stray elbow clipped a bottle. Burgundy arced across. White linen, a dark streak down a sequined sleeve.
Oh.
Chairs scraped. Margaret Voss stood like a judge, hand flashing toward an empty finger. "My ring," she announced, loud enough to hush the room. She palmed it. Mr. Grayson arrived, mouth tight, already choosing a side. Napkins were shaken out, pockets turned, locker opened, nothing found. Still, he pointed to the door. "You're finished." Conversations resumed in a sharper register. Phones tilted for a better look as Lila untied her apron and stepped into cold air that smelled of kelp and wet stone. Wind pressed mist against her cheeks. She reached for the crescent at her throat. A small moon on a thin chain, warm from her skin, the only thing that had ever felt like hers, and closed her fist around it. Through the steamed glass, a man in a corner booth rose halfway and went motionless. Ethan Caldwell had eaten in silence all evening. But the charm's tilt toward the streetlight caught a shallow scratch near the clasp, a mark he knew like a scar. His pulse went jagged. Memory surged. A deck light on black water, a child's laugh cut short, a silver crescent spinning toward the sea. He pushed through the door as rain began, not caring that his coat darkened with it. Lila turned, expecting another accusation, and saw a stranger staring as if he'd recognized a ghost. Ethan's gaze didn't touch her face. It clung to the necklace, as though it were a key he'd been hunting for years. Somewhere behind them, Margaret's laughter rang too brightly. What he saw in that pendant would unravel a secret that could change everything. What happened next will shock you. The sapphire crest wore its glamour like armor while the sea kept knocking at the windows. Lila Harper tied her hair, smoothed her apron, and stepped into a night that wanted perfection. She moved between white cloths and candlelight with a tray, steady as a compass, counting breaths while piano notes skated over talk of grants and weekend sailboats. Lila ignored the ache in her arches and let habit guide her hands. Water left, plates right, smile neutral, voice low. The first hour blurred into orders and small rescues. Guests saw calm and imagined ease. Only the staff recognized what it cost. She had started at noon. Lila said of course to nearly everything because saying no invited storylines she could not afford. During a 30-second break, she stepped outside, breathed cold brine, and touched the crescent at her throat. The charm had lived against her skin for as long as she remembered keeping anything. On the back, fine letters formed a phrase she had traced so often the metal carried the memory of her fingertip. Per mare ad luna. Through the sea to the moon. It came from a shoebox. A caseworker pressed it into her arms, the day of foster placement. Ended while she was at school. Most of the box held things that felt borrowed from someone else's life, but the necklace felt like hers. Homes after that changed like the weather. She learned not to ask for more than a bed and a door that latched. She learned to pack quickly and leave quietly. She learned that keeping one object, one phrase, might be a form of staying whole. It did not fix anything. By 7, the private wing filled with donors who wore applause like a habit. Mr. Grayson. The manager hovered near the bar, counting very obvious smiles. Lila ferried plates past tuxedoed elbows and lacquered clutches, calling out corners as if she were on a boat. Into that light came Margaret Voss, pearls like small moons along her throat, eyes measuring everything. She slid into the corner banquette and arranged her friends the way a host arranges a tableau. "Keep our glasses full," she said, without looking at the person who would do it. Lila nodded and kept moving. She did not mind work when it had rhythm. Trouble came when rhythm met ego. Lila lifted a fresh tray and threaded through a corridor of chairs. A donor began a speech about coastal resilience. The room tipped its attention toward the stage. A man at an aisle seat threw his elbow wide. Gasps rose. Before she could blot the stain, Margaret stood. "My ring," she said, bright enough for the back row. Her gaze sharpened on Lila. "She bumped me." Mr. Grayson hurried over, face pale with calculations, phones tilted.
Lila.
Offered pockets an apron, and even shoes. The locker held a bus pass and lip balm, nothing important to anyone else. Margaret watched like a patron at a rehearsal. Cool, patient, certain the ending would suit her. Grayson's voice softened into policy. "You have to protect donors," he said, as if the room were a fragile organism. He never really looked at Lila, only around her. The story stabilized. The rich guest was wronged, and the server was a suspect. Lila felt the old ice of being small in a house where adults lost things and called it theft. A nearby table murmured that everyone says that. Someone suggested cameras. Then he did what people in charge do when fear meets convenience. "You're finished," he said, and spoke it like the weather. Lila untied her apron with deliberate hands. She laid it on a side chair, smoothed the wrinkles, and stood up straight. Heat burned behind her eyes, but she would not let it show. She pressed the crescent into her palm until she felt the letters. Per mera ad luna. She could have begged. Begging would feed the room. She could have shouted. Shouting would have given them a reason. She chose stillness. In the service hall, she took off her coat and looked out a small window where mist turned headlights into ghosts. She would not pawn the necklace. A broker had once weighed it, admired the Latin, and offered a price that felt like erasing a name. She had walked away and sat by the pier until her shoulders dropped and the tide erased her footprints. Back in the dining room, Margaret began retelling the loss for fresh ears, polishing each detail until it gleamed. She described a brush, an agile hand, a vanishing spark. Grayson hovered like a stage manager, promising resolution. Lila returned to set a small card on the table. "If your ring turns up," she said evenly, "the manager will know." She did not gift them fury or tears. She walked toward the corridor with the measured steps of someone crossing ice. A man in a shadowed booth by the window had watched. From the moment the moon at Lila's throat tipped toward the bar light, Ethan Caldwell had eaten alone, speaking to no one, carrying a silence that money usually buys. He had come to this coast to think in the language of rain and rock, to hear something older than his name. Success had given him rooms that obeyed him. Grief gave him neighborhoods of thought he could not patrol. A memory rode with him the way a scar rides under cloth, a boat-cutting night. Laughter blown thin by wind, a sudden slip, the slap of water. Then a quiet that changed maps. Oregon drew him because storms told the truth. Now, a small crescent caught a beam and showed a faint scratch near the clasp. A mark he recognized from years he would rather not examine. He told himself he was mistaken, that many charms look alike. The room narrowed anyway, as if the windows had moved closer. He folded his napkin and waited while the scene ran its course. He watched how Lila handled humiliation without caving. Questions sharpened. Where did she get that keepsake? Why did the Latin match a phrase he had stopped saying? How? Could a life he thought buried walk past with bread in a steady hand? Lila paused at the staff door, then turned back because leaving, without a word, felt like surrender. She placed the card, met Margaret's gaze for a heartbeat with no apology in it, and stepped away. The crescent slid along her collarbone, cool as rain. She pushed into the hallway, and the room's sound faded to a dull chorus. Outside, surf pounded the bluffs, rain began in fine needles, and pine lifted a clean scent from the headlands. She tucked coins into a pocket, checked the bus schedule by memory, and counted her breaths again. Inside, Ethan traced the rim of a thought until it cut. He would move carefully. Hope can drown faster than truth can swim. Yet the sight of that charm had opened a door he believed sealed. He felt the pull of a past he had armored over with. Work and distance, the kind of pull that makes a person risk being wrong in public. Lila stepped into the mist and kept walking, a soft glow at her throat and a stubborn kind of faith in her chest. Behind her, money rearranged conversation and called it closure. Ahead, the cliff path shone damp, and the night smelled like kelp and rain. Have you ever felt the sting of injustice, yet held on to something that gave you hope? Lila left the restaurant with her jaw set and followed the bluff road as fog pushed in from the Pacific, softening street lamps until they looked like ships. The bus sighed to a stop, rode near the back while rain tapped the windows in the Town slid by in gray streaks. At Harborview, which had no view and hardly counted as shelter. She climbed cracked stairs and found an envelope under her door. The paper was damp, the ink blurred, yet the message held. Final notice. Rent overdue. Payment by Friday. Eviction to follow. She sat on the narrow mattress and reread each line, hoping repetition might turn a decree into a suggestion. At her throat pressed a small weight against bone, warm from her skin. She set the envelope on a crate that served as a table, lifted the chain, and laid the charm across her palm. Letters curved along the back in strokes so fine a stranger might miss them. Per mare ad luna. Through the sea to the moon. She had whispered it on nights when the world felt too loud, telling herself movement could be a promise. The room smelled of damp plaster. Her belongings would fit into 2 bags, a thrifted coat, paperbacks, a chipped mug, a coastline torn from a calendar, and the shoebox that had once carried the necklace. She had imagined selling it before, always as a draft that slid under the door and drifted away. Tonight the thought stood in the room. She opened the box, set the charm inside, closed the lid, and listened to the city's slow heartbeat. Foghorns called from the bay. Tires hissed on wet asphalt. She slid the box into her backpack and stood, because motion keeps fear from settling. Water Street wore neon above dark windows. A barred door on a pawn shop sweated salt. She stepped inside. The clerk looked up. She set the box on the counter while keeping a palm on the lid. She lifted the crescent. The chain pooled like a thin river of light. She studied it, nodded once, and said it wasn't junk, not ordinary. Likely European, engraving in Latin. He named a figure that would clear the arrears and leave small change. Relief did not arrive. Cold replaced the relief she expected. The clerk suggested she'd think about it and return with ID. She closed her fingers around the moon until its points pressed skin. "Thank you," she said. Outside, fog thickened until even the far curb blurred. Her phone buzzed, a job alert still tied to the sapphire crest. She deleted it and watched the screen reset to empty. That blank frightened her more than any number. She went back to Harborview with the charm in her pocket and told herself she would decide at dawn. Across town, Ethan sat in a rented workspace. Near the marina, sleeves rolled, eyes on a screen lit by public records and clipped newsprint. He had planned to drive to his temporary house above the point and listen to the rain, yet the sight of that charm felt like a flare over black water, and ignoring it felt like abandoning somebody again. He entered what little he knew, a first name from a staff sheet, workplace, approximate age. Search engines spat fragments that went nowhere. A payroll lookup confirmed she existed at the restaurant. But the profile had gaps where family entries normally sit, as if chapters had been erased. He pulled public court files and cross-referenced addresses. The pattern told its own story. Moves every year or two, late summer transfers, clinic visits paid in cash. No listed emergency contact, no shared loans, no voter record anywhere he tried. He recognized that absence because it mirrored a hole left by one night, a sister missing where charts cannot reach. A house that echoed differently afterward. Work became a fortress. He opened an archived article about a boating accident and let ink do what memory could not. A deck light and a wave hitting wrong. A silver crescent worn over pajamas because some talismans refused drawers. Afterward came days of searches that felt like years. The ring he kept lived in a drawer like a heartbeat he could not evict. Inside its band, the same phrase curved in tiny script, per mare ad luna. He had not worn it since an anniversary went. He nearly threw it into the surf and could not bear the imagined sound against stone. Tonight he set it by the keyboard, where it shone with a soft, stubborn light. He checked shelter rosters, his foundation funded, scanning patterns rather than names. Several would open early. Until then, he mapped routes a person without cash might walk after a bus ride home. Meanwhile, Lila held the necklace up so its shadow turned the notice below into a small lunar arc. She tried to picture a substitute, a trinket with no story. The thought made her chest tighten. She breathed through it, counting 6 beats in, and 6 out, a method a clinic therapist had taught years ago. Her mind flickered to the manager's face, the way he looked anywhere but at her, and humiliation threatened to tip into rage. She let it pass like a wave that lifts without breaking. There was no time for rage. She needed work by sunrise or a plan by noon. The crescent went back around her neck with a familiarity that steadied her legs. Outside, a fog bank slid into town and turned everyone into silhouettes. In his workspace, Ethan made a list of questions he would ask if fate seated them at the same table. Where did you get that charm? Who gave it to you? What do you remember from early summers? Do you recall a deck, a laugh, a phrase, H possibility? It felt dangerous, forced himself to accept coincidence as the likely answer. Still, coincidence had never felt this precise. A scratch near the clasp matched a repair he remembered from a day in a marina shop, an older man shaking his head at kids who treated a keepsake like a toy. He closed his eyes and heard a small voice saying, "Promise me you'll never lose it." And his reply, "Never." That lie helped build a fortune because he spent years proving from other angles that he could keep what mattered. Lila folded her coat over the chair and lay down fully dressed because exhaustion sometimes felt safer than dreams. She pressed the charm to her lips and felt it cool, then warm. She thought of Clara, who would say, "Come over," without weighing pride, and of Tomas, who might hear rumors she could use. Tomorrow, she would ask for help. For now, she let foghorns sketch the shoreline in her head and drifted just enough to dull the sharpest edges. Sleep came in thin shreds, drifting and snapping, while the radiator ticked and the ocean kept time below the cliffs, steady as breath, steady as a stubborn wish. Ethan watched night climb the window and decided to visit the shelter near the pier at dawn. Not as a benefactor, but as a brother in possibility, ready to accept error or miracle. Outside, the ocean breathed, and the town answered in steam and light. What would you do if a single object could unlock your past? Rain slashed sideways along the bluff road, and Lila reached Clara's cramped trailer with numb fingers and a jaw locked hard enough to ache. Inside, a wheezing heater coughed at the damp, while a dented kettle clicked but refused to boil, and Clara, hair twisted into a pencil, nudged a laundry basket off a narrow bench and said, "Without ceremony, you're staying here tonight." Lila wanted to argue, then saw the stubborn set in her friend's mouth and didn't. Instead, she slipped off her soaked coat, hung it on a bent hook, and lowered herself onto a cushion that sagged like a tired lung. The little place smelled of soap, clean cotton, and rain seeping through seams. A postcard of Cannon Beach, held to a cabinet by a chipped magnet, showed haystacks and summer sunlight so bright it felt like a trick. Lila touched the crescent resting against her collarbone. The metal warmed from her skin and pressed a breath through her teeth. "I can't go back," she said. "Not tonight." Clara poured 2 mugs of instant cocoa and bumped her shoulder. "You won't," she replied. "Tomorrow we start again." The word again tasted like grit. Lila pulled the eviction notice from her bag and laid it flat on the table. The paper had wrinkled in her pocket, and the ink bled at the edges, but the meaning stayed sharp. Clara read without comment, and capped a red marker and slashed a new line over the deadline as if a bolder date could bend reality. "We'll figure it out," she said, voice steady. Wind pushed at the door. Something on the roof clicked in protest. They ate noodles from chipped bowls while the heater rattled like a determined insect. Lila described the spill, the accusation, the search, the way Mr. Grayson looked everywhere but at her, and Margaret's bright gaze, hungry for spectacle. Saying it out loud made the room tilt again. She set the bowl aside and traced the charm's edge, feeling its tiny letters with her thumb, the scratched tail near the clasp like a secret scar. Clara watched and didn't try to touch it. "You could pawn it," she said softly, and then shook her head before Lila answered. "Forget I said that. You'd regret it every morning you reached for your throat." Lila swallowed and nodded. "I almost did," she confessed. "I couldn't." Clara flicked the kettle off, then don't. Across town, a bell rang over a plain door above a bait shop, where the floor smelled of line oil and salt. Stepped into a room with a scarred desk, a corkboard dense with notes, and a woman with salt gray hair tied in a knot that didn't move even when the wind shoved through the cracked window. Raylan shook his hand once, eyes measuring, not impressed by money, interested in urgency. "You said it's about a necklace," she said, dragging a legal pad closer. He told her about the dining room, the moon on a chain, the tilt of light that caught a shallow scratch, the sudden punch of memory he couldn't swallow back down. "I'm not looking for a story," he added. "I need the truth. If I'm wrong, say so." Ray's pencil tapped once. "I don't sell comfort," she said. "I sell what is." She made 3 calls in less than a minute, then slid the pad across to him. "Write exactly what you think the engraving says." Ethan wrote the phrase, without looking away from the page, "Per mare ad luna." When he pushed the pad back, Ray glanced at the ring he had placed beside it without realizing, a band he rarely allowed out of its drawer. "I'll need a better look." At her piece, she said, "Street cameras, bus routes, dock footage. I'll start with the harbor and the park out by the dunes." He nodded, left a retainer that made no sound when it touched the desk, and walked out into rain that felt like pins. In the trailer park, Lila tried to sleep, but kept counting breaths, images rising anyway, Margaret patting an empty finger with theatrical horror. Mr. Grayson's mouth-shaping policy, the way conversations resumed as though verdicts were weather. Near midnight, her phone buzzed with a message from Tomas. "Come to the back gate at 10. I need to show you something." She replied with a thank you and put the phone face down. The relief that came with his name surprised her and made her throat hurt. Dawn arrived, smudged and cold. Clara drove because the puddles on the park road were deep enough to hide nails. The sedan grumbled over washboard gravel like a fussy older man. At the service entrance of the Sapphire Crest, steam drifted from a vent and carried garlic, butter, coffee, and polish. Tomas appeared with a crate of glasses, nervous and determined. He glanced at the security camera, angled it toward a blind spot, and pulled a small velvet pouch from his pocket. Inside lay a ring that glittered and failed at the same time. "I found it in the waste behind the pastry station," he whispered. "Not hers, not the real thing. Look." He turned the band so a tiny CZ etched inside caught the light. Plated metal had flaked near a prong, leaving a bruise of dull base. "Fake," he said. "Someone staged a loss with a $50 prop." Lila stared. He'd smacked her chest, then drained away, leaving her cold. "So she lied," she said, and heard how flat the words sounded, as if surprise itself had. "Given up," Tomas swallowed. "Tell Clara to hold you tight. This town loves money's version first." She handed the pouch back. "Keep it. If I carry it, it becomes a problem." He nodded once, eyes fierce. "I've got you," she squeezed. His arm and left, heart pounding in a rhythm that felt like resolve. Ray's network moved like tidewater through pilings. A bus driver remembered a woman in a green coat getting off near the park. A cashier at a 24-hour market recalled the same woman buying instant soup and staring at her phone as though it might tell her a different story. A marina camera caught a blurred profile under a street lamp, the chain lifting when wind flattened fabric, enough to show a sliver of silver and the ghost of small letters. Ray compiled the stills, circled the charm's curve in one frame, and texted Ethan, "We have a tale of the engraving and the scratch you described." He met her at noon under a gull-haunted awning, took the printouts in both hands, and knew before he breathed again that he was not chasing smoke. The opening of the P matched the flourish inside his band. Spacing aftermare felt identical. Even the scratch near the clasp, small and diagonal, pulled his stomach into his knees. He set his ring beside the photo on the wet railing and watched rain bead on both metals, his pulse jumping like a fish in a bucket. Ray said nothing, letting the scene decide him. He heard night water, a deck light, a child's laugh that ended too fast, and a silver crescent spinning through black air. He closed his fist and opened it again. "Find her," he said. Carefully, she nodded. The trailer Clara circled job listings and drew a star beside a temp agency that didn't ask for references if you could lift boxes. Lila wrote a neat list on a torn envelope. Agency, diner by the cannery, motel on 3rd. help at the shelter kitchen. She added a final item without hesitation. Talk to a legal aid clinic about Mr. Grayson. The heater coughed, and then broke, leaving bright gull cries and a smell of wet pine. Clara squeezed her hand. "We're not made of money," she said, "but we're made of stubborn." Lila laughed despite the knot in her chest and pocketed a bus pass Clara insisted she take. Afternoon went dark early. Thunder rolled across headlands like drums. They split chowder under a neon sign that hummed and flickered. And a radio near the griddle praised Margaret as a pillar of coastal recovery, a generous leader, an example. Lila choked on a crumb of bread. Clara snorted. "She performs generosity. Like theater," she muttered. "Real help doesn't need a spotlight." Lila pictured the pouch, the flaking band, the cloudy heart of a cheap stone, and the memory steadied her breathing. Across the point, Ethan walked the overlook near the lighthouse where cliffs rose like broken teeth and spray stitched the air with salt. He slid the ring onto his smallest finger and let it warm, eyes on a seam of pale light opening over rough water. He did not ask for miracles. He asked for clarity and the courage to accept either outcome. The charm marked the girl he had. Watched from that booth, then loss had not swallowed everything he loved. And a map he had redrawn 1,000 times needed new lines. If he were wrong, he would put the band back in its drawer and call the impulse a storm's trick. Wind shoved at his coat. He stood anyway. Ray texted one more still as dusk slouched in, this time from a bus ride her contact repeated at lunch. The moon in the picture hung above a jacket zipper, tilted just enough to show the engraving's tail, a script he could have traced blindfolded. He felt something lift inside him that he had kept pinned for years. Not certainty, not yet, but hope that cut clean. In the trailer, Lila lay awake while Clara slept, the roof ticking under scattered drops, the heater finally quiet. She held the charm in her palm and let it cool, then warm again, whispering the phrase that had carried her through nights without anchors. Through houses with thin walls and rules that changed when doors closed, through the sea to the moon. Outside, the ocean beat the bluff like a giant slow heart, and the town breathed, and somewhere between the lights and the water, a man with a ring studied a photograph and decided the past might not be finished with either of them. Morning broke with a dull pewter sky and rain ticking on fir needles, and Lila left Clara's trailer before dawn to chase work where rumors said hours might be found. The temp desk on Front Street smelled of toner and stale coffee. A harried clerk slid forms across a scarred counter and fingered a stack of orange badges. Lila filled every box, wrote references, circled late shifts, and kept her voice even. When the call finally came, the clerk listened, lowered her eyes, said a donor from the Sapphire Crest had flagged her as unreliable after an incident, so the agency had to pass. Outside, logging trucks roared through mist, and gutters sang. Lila walked to the Cannery Diner, where fryers hissed and windows fogged over with grease and rain. The owner liked quick hands and quiet talk. He studied Lila's resume, nodded at her experience, then took a call that stretched into silence. He returned with a distant look and a rehearsed apology about a full roster and union rules. She thanked him anyway, stepped back into wet air, and felt the town closing like a fist. At the motel on 3rd, a woman with a neat bob and a key rack, shaped like a lighthouse, said the night desk position had vanished. A board member's niece needed hours to pad a scholarship file. At a grocery near the river, a manager praised punctuality, asked for a start date, then checked a tablet and found a note that made his mouth go flat. He wished her luck without meeting her eyes. Margaret's circle stretched farther than a single dining room. Money spoke in whispers and doors answered. Lila kept moving because to stop would mean listening to the old voice that said, "Leave now before they push you." Fir branches combed the wind, dripping over sidewalks. She cut through a park where ferns glowed electric and birds scolded from wet alder. A shelter kitchen served coffee to anyone who picked up a ladle. And Lila scrubbed pans until her shoulders burned because effort tones down panic. A volunteer coordinator offered a small envelope for bus fare and asked if she needed a bed. Pride said no. Memory said maybe soon, and honesty said not yet. She tucked the envelope into her pocket, whispered thanks, and stepped back into a rain that had sharpened 2 needles. Across the headland, Ethan met Ray in a windowless room above the bait shop, where space heaters clicked and maps pinned with thread formed a lattice over the coast. Ray had pulled tax filings, donor lists, and board reports linked to Margaret's charities. A forensic accountant from Ethan's Seattle office joined by video, voice dry as paper, while numbers stacked like waves. A second mortgage on a seaside house, a line of credit maxed out, an art loan to a gala and never returned, a bridge loan coming due next month, and a private banker calling twice a day. The picture formed without drama, a woman who needed spectacle to keep plates spinning. Ray slid a printout across the desk showing payments to a jewelry house that specialized in replicas for stage wear. The purchase date matched the week before the benefit. Tomas's discovery of the cheap ring now looked like a pry bar slipped under a lie. Ethan felt anger rise, then separate into purpose. She needed a crisis that proved her victimhood, Ray said. Creating one let her control the room. The accountant highlighted transfers between accounts that looked like a shell game dressed as philanthropy. Motive glowed from the page. Ray added the last piece. Calls from Margaret's assistant to managers. Crosstown labeled as informal references regarding a waitress with boundary issues. The block list had been built in hours. Ethan closed his eyes, then set his ring beside the printouts as if to steady them. He could buy the restaurant outright, fire the man, sue the donor, and still leave Lila adrift. So, he swallowed the instinct to fix everything with a wire. We find her, he said. We learn the truth, and then daylight it. Lila crossed to the old pawn shop near the ferry slip, the one with an iron bell and a watchmaker's loop welded to a lamp. The broker wore a tweed vest and kept a ledger in longhand. He weighed the moon, listened to its tiny chain clink, then took out a loop and peered at the clasp. Not a toy, he murmured. Silver, but the engraving suggests a finer hand. Look. At the script, the way the tail on the R curls back, that's not catalog work. He flipped a page in a reference book and showed a plate of hallmarks from northern Italy. Venice, he said, tapping a stamp like a tiny star beside a letter. Older clasp style, Italian cut on the links, and that motto belonged to trading families who did business on water. A silversmith near the lagoon might have produced this for a private commission. He named a figure that would pay rent, groceries, and a week of breathing room. Lila's mouth dried. The shop smelled of oil, old clocks, and salt. She pictured herself walking out lighter, pocket full, neck bare, the phrase gone from touch. The silence that followed felt like grief. She closed her fingers over the crescent, sensing the familiar scratch near the clasp, a flaw she trusted more than promises. I can't, she said, voice steady despite the tremor at its edge. The broker didn't argue. Good, he said gently. Some things shouldn't be liquid. See you keep it. She thanked him, slipped the chain back under her collar, left with both relief and fear, burning different paths through her chest. Ray's updates moved like rain bands. Cameras on the bus route caught Lila riding toward the Marina District at odd hours. A shelter log listed a volunteer named L. Harper washing pots and serving stew at midday twice a week. A market receipt showed soup, bread, and tea in amounts that suited to people in a small space. Clara's name appeared on an old lease near the trailer park, and a neighbor remembered a woman with a green coat and careful eyes. Ray pinned each piece on the board, stepped back, and circled a radius around a specific church basement with cots and a bulletin board that changed daily. Harbor Haven, she said. If she needs help without paperwork, she'll drift through here. Ethan stared at the circle until the map lost color. He remembered telling himself to accept coincidence. The map now refused that story, he remembered. The scratch on the clasp, the engraving, the tilt in the light, and his sister's laugh across dark water years ago. Yet he paced his hope because memory can lie like fog. I'll go, he said. Ray shook her head. Let me make the first pass. If she sees a billionaire walking into a shelter, she bolts, he agreed, though staying behind felt like standing in a storm with his hands at his sides. By late afternoon, the rain swelled, ropes of water dragging moss from shingles. Lila and Clara split a tuna melt under a tin awning while headlights smeared across puddles. A boy on a skateboard shot past, trailing spray. A dog shook and showered everyone within 2 yards. Would have been ordinary if not for the way conversations shifted when Lila entered rooms, warmer at first, then cooler. The diner's owner, who used to send her home with leftover pie, blessed her while refusing to take her resume. The motel clerk said, "Come back next month," with references from a city to hours inland. Even the temp desk sent a form email warning of future opportunities that would never arrive. Lila swallowed each slight like medicine and kept breathing. She wouldn't let Margaret define her, yet Margaret's shadow followed her into laundromats and waiting rooms. Clara squeezed her hand hard enough to hurt. "We'll make noise when we've got evidence," she said. "For now, food, sleep, and a plan." At dusk, Ray slipped into Harbor Haven with a plastic bin of donated blankets and eyes that recorded faces without staring. Steam rose from a line of pots. A man hummed while chopping onions. A woman balled socks and told an old joke to a kid, who refused to smile until the punchline forced it. Ray found the volunteer ledger, scanned the last page, and saw L. Harper is penciled in for Friday. She asked the coordinator whether a woman matching Lila's description had been by today. "Not since morning," the coordinator said. "She works hard, never asks for anything, always checks our cots before she leaves like she's counting them for someone else." Ray texted Ethan. "Likely here tomorrow," replied with a single word that carried years of restraint. "Ready?" Night lowered like a lid. Lila stood with Clara outside the trailer as clouds broke for a breath and a thin stripe of pale sky opened. Over black pines. The surf's thud slipped under traffic and made a low drum beneath town sounds. She pressed the charm flat with her palm and pictured a city across the Atlantic where boats glide under bridges, where glass catches light like water, where some artisan bent close to carve a motto that had traveled farther than either of them guessed. The thought tightened her throat and steadied her spine. If a piece of silver could cross oceans in years, then a person might cross shame and stand up again. She promised herself she would not hand over the only thread that tied her to a story, bigger than rooms at close to Islay. She would fight quietly, gather proof, and keep moving through rain heavy enough to make a forest sing. She lifted her eyes to the dark and felt strength arrive like a tide that refuses to turn. Without moonlight guiding it, have you ever held on to something knowing it's your only link to who you are? Dawn dragged its gray hem over Harbor Haven, while gulls pealed cries from the rafters and steam lifted from stewpots like breath. Lila wiped a counter until the wood shone, checked the rows of cots by habit, counted blankets, straightened pillows, trying to make order where she could as rain pressed at the windows with impatient fingers. The door sighed, and a draft threaded salt and cedar through the hallway. Ray arrived first with a bin of linens, nodded to the coordinator, set the load, near the pass, and moved aside. Behind her, a tall man paused as if the room might refuse him. Ethan stepped in, eyes adjusting to fluorescent glare, ring on his smallest finger, a private planet. He spotted the necklace before he found her face, a thin crescent resting against a green jacket tilted toward the light, and for a breath the world narrowed to metal and memory. Per mare ad luna, he thought, and the floor seemed to pitch under him like a skiff tipping toward a swell. Ray murmured to the coordinator about blankets and intake, then drifted toward the back door, understanding that some meetings need a witness only long enough to vanish. Lila rinsed a rag, returned to a stubborn stain, and looked up because the air had changed. The tiny hairs on her arms lifted, not from cold, but recognition she could not name. Ethan moved closer until the engraving sharpened and the familiar, shallow nick near the clasp caught a shard of light. He reached without thinking, checked himself, and stopped his hand in midair. "I know that charm," he said, voice low enough to keep from breaking. Lila had heard begging and fury and wild laughter inside halls like this, but never that blend of terror and relief, as if speaking hurt and healed at once. She touched the moon at her throat and felt her pulse bounce against silver. "Do you need a meal?" she managed, buying a few seconds to steady her breath. "I need an answer," he said, and nodded to Ray, who pivoted away, leaving quiet around them. "Where did you get it? Who gave it to you?" Lila's fingers tightened around the crescent. A caseworker handed me a shoebox the day a placement ended. The necklace was inside. They said it was the only thing that came with me for sure. Ethan shut his eyes and opened them again, a storm clearing to bleak hope. My family had 2 pieces, he said, a ring and a moon. They were made for a sister and a brother. The band is mine. The moon was hers. Lila shook her head before sense could land. You're mistaken. I don't have a brother. He pulled a slim envelope from his coat, slid out a photograph, and laid it on the counter. 2 children stood on a dock washed in summer light, a boy with a pale band on a cord, a girl with a silver crescent flashing as she turned her head, hair stuck to sunscreen, mouth open in mid-laugh. Behind them, the sea looked tame, the lie water tells on quiet afternoons. 4 hands from 2 adults floated just outside the frame, not quite touching, trusting the day. Ethan tapped the girl's face with a finger that shook. This is you, he said. This is Alina. The name bent in her ears, a sound from a country she had never visited and somehow knew. Alina. She wanted to set the photo back and return to tasks that made sense: stack bowls, mop tiles, check stock, move through. A list until night forgave morning. Instead, she took the picture with both hands and felt the paper bite. The child's eyes matched the mirror in her small apartment. That crooked grin mirrored a reflex she had noticed in awkward snapshots. At the child's throat glowed a crescent, bearing the same tiny flaw near the clasp. Lila touched the matching nick at her neck and felt the ground rearrange. Wind hit the wall, and the building shuddered. A pot lid rang. Someone laughed in the kitchen. A girl near the door coughed. Her mother soothed her with a hum that barely rose above the clatter. Time slowed to the pace of surf. Ethan steadied his voice the way a body steadies on a deck. Our parents used to say the world's messy, but we had a map, he said. Per mare ad luna, through the sea to the moon. We said it every night. Before lights out, tapping the ring and the moon together. A promise. Promise made Lila's throat tightened. In houses she knew, promises broke before lunch and were replaced by new ones before dinner. Yet his version carried the gravity of ritual, not performance. She stared at the photograph as if it might fracture into a kinder story. Ethan's gaze shifted to the window where rain streaked like tears. One night a squall came early, he said. No warning, just a shoulder in the dark. The boat pitched. The rail slicked. You slipped. I caught fabric. It tore. The crescent spun. Then water. He did not rush the rest. He placed each word as if laying glass. Searchers worked for days. They told us grief needs ceremony, so we built one without a body. I wore the ring on a chain like it might tow you home. Everyone said the ocean keeps what it takes. I learned how to live over a hole. Then I saw you cross a dining room with that moon-catching light the way it did years ago, and my heart knew before my mind would. Lila tried to answer and found speech required air she did not own. She set the photograph down as if it were dangerous. Ray set a cup of water near her hand and drifted back again. Lila swallowed and shook her head slowly, the way a person shakes sand from their ears after a wave fills them. You're saying I'm Ethan Caldwell, she whispered. Ethan nodded, careful not to press. He slid another photo across, a cake, with a crooked moon piped in pale icing, a card in a child's hand reading to Lina, fly high, a close shot of script inside a band. Then he placed his ring beside her necklace. Look, he said. She bent until the engraving filled her vision. Fog braided the pines along the cliff road as Ethan guided the car toward a house that leaned into the wind like a patient ship, glass catching the dim Pacific while gulls tilted over slate water. Beside him, Lila now. The name a new weight, watched the shoreline unspool and felt the town behind her shrink into mist. The driveway curved through salal and cedar to a terrace of weathered stone.
Oh.
The mansion rose from basalt. All. Timber, steel, and windows that refused curtains. Inside, warmth breathed from radiant floors, and cedar walls held a summer scent, even on a gray morning. A painting of moonlit water hung over a hearth wide enough to hold a small tree. Ethan set her bag down and hesitated, as if rushing might startle her. then offered a tour that felt less like a display and more like an introduction. He showed a kitchen with blade-straight knives and long counters, library organized by mood, rather than alphabet, studio facing the breakers where the glass seemed to float, a small wing with 2 bedrooms looking north toward the headlands, and at the quiet end of a hall, a room he had kept simple, nothing fragile, nothing loud. A folded card rested on the dresser, her new name printed in clean letters. She touched the card, spoke it under her breath, and felt both truth and ache climb her throat. Alina stepped to the window and met her reflection layered over the sea. The crescent lay warm in the hollow of her neck. Ethan's ring caught a pale gleam against his palm. They stood a pace apart, 2 halves of a phrase stitched together again. Silence settled, not empty, only full of measured breath. He said he had sent the staff away for a week so she could learn the corners without eyes turning to follow. She needed help, he would be near. She wanted space, he would honor that too. She unpacked slowly, folding thrifted shirts into drawers that slid without sound, setting a chipped mug beside crystal that looked like arrested ice. Comfort felt like deep water. One step dazzled, the next suggested a drop. She kept reaching for old habits. Count your change. Hide your good. Pen, keep your bag by the door. Han had to remind her hands that locks here held. Clara texted a run of hearts and a rule to sleep with the window cracked for ocean noise. Lena smiled and cracked it, letting salt drift across the sill. Ethan brewed strong coffee and set 2 cups on the table while Rain combed the glass. Carried a thin wooden box that smelled of salt and citrus oil. Inside lay photographs, letters, and a map with routes traced in pencil. He spoke about parents who collected stories the way some people collect stamps. A teacher who turned science into treasure hunts. An engineer who could fix anything with patience, and a diagram to people who believed maps were invitations. They said yes to tides and storms and complicated questions, and at night they tapped the moon to ring and whispered the motto that lived inside both pieces. Lena studied a picture of a blue-painted window seat, a lopsided cake with a sugar crescent, a beach morning where a dog with a bent ear tried to swallow a shell. She looked up whenever his voice thinned, steadying him with a touch that steadied her. After lunch, he opened a safe and set out paper that carried weight without shine. Birth certificates. A deed for a small house on a calmer bay, a charter, for a foundation naming both children as future stewards. Their parents had built scholarships for coastal kids who worked weekends, grants for harbors that kept rescue boats fueled, and funds for clinics that never asked for insurance first. The empire Ethan built from code and stubborn focus piggybacked on that ethic. The foundation had grown until it reached schools, boats, labs, and shelters she already knew by smell. Alina felt both pride and unease. Money like this could clear paths, but it could also erase fingerprints. She explored while he took a call. The bathroom held a tub big enough to float, a robe soft as fog, and taps that delivered water like rain. She ran her fingertips along the limestone, then pulled back, afraid of smudging the expense with old worry. The closet held a few new things that looked like her without announcing a makeover. A moss green sweater, dark jeans without logos, boots built for cliff paths. She tried the sweater, stared at the mirror, and whispered Alina twice. Then Lila once, honoring both stones in one pocket. As the afternoon faded to pearl, fog slid in long scarves over the water and turned the world to soft edges. Ethan found her on the terrace, wrapped in a blanket, watching cormorants arrow toward the point. He spoke without preamble. He would address the restaurant first. Mr. Grayson had chosen ease over fairness. Letters had been drafted, statements prepared, and timing aligned with a board meeting that would not go the way Margaret expected. He would not let a patron who loved applause make a cruel policy, yet he asked how she wanted justice served, because repair should match the harmed, not the fixer. Alina named 3 needs without raising her voice: public correction, pay restored, with interest, and a donation directed to Harbor Haven in her name without cameras. Ethan nodded and added a 4th for his lane: consequences scaled to fraud. They drove at dusk to the shelter with blankets and groceries, because beginnings feel steadier when tethered to continuities. The coordinator hugged Alina hard enough to reset her bones. Word had spread in soft rumors that family found family. Dote. Nobody asked for details, only grinned as if the coast itself had delivered a dividend. On the way back, headlights chased mist, and the road narrowed to a ribbon. Pines leaned in, drip lines tracing arcs on the windshield. Waves threw pale breath against the cliff and retreated tireless. Night brought a quiet she had never known. The sea boomed below and then whispered back, like breath returning after a long run. She lay awake, naming objects until strangeness softened. Lamp, chair, blanket, card, window, sky, water. She thought of foster houses where doors never latched, and meals tasted of hurry, of rides taken with a paper ticket and a plastic bag, of faces that blurred because remembering hurt, of Clara's fearless jokes delivered when lights flickered, of Tomas's steady eyes behind a dish rack. She pressed the crescent to her lips and thanked the girl who had guarded it across years, then let sleep flatten resistance. Morning arrived, with gull cries and rain threading fine silver lines down glass. At breakfast, Ethan showed headlines hinting that Margaret's charity had delayed filings. Ray had pulled replica invoices and a timeline that made the theft story theatrical. An investigator would meet Tomas, document the fake ring, and expose the truth. Ethan promised to stand between Alina and whatever came next. She thanked him and reminded him she had hands, a spine, and a voice. He smiled because each wanted the other to be protected without being smothered. Later, fog lifted enough to show a path spidering down the bluff. They walked single file through sword fern and foxglove while drizzles stitched to their sleeves. The air smelled of crushed fir tips and clean rock. Below, tide shouldered in and slipped back. Never tired, always deliberate. At the beach, she took off her boots and let icy water bite, a dare met with grit. He skipped a flat stone that spun and kissed foam. They spoke about small things until space opened for larger truths. Ethan admitted he feared that wealth could build a mirrored box, a place where yes replaced thought. Lina admitted she feared vanishing into someone else's legend, a rescued girl with a tidy arc. They agreed to practice a family built on questions, not scripts. Back at the house, she called Clara from the studio framed by water and sky. Her friend whooped, then went quiet and said the only line that mattered. "I knew you were more than what they said." Lena laughed until tears came and promised a spare room always. She set the phone down and pressed her forehead to the cool pane, watching fog lift in tatters that revealed sunlight sliding like a coin along distant swells. The world looked older and kinder and exactly as hard as before, only clearer. Evening. Lace silver across the windows. Ethan lit a fire and handed her a battered field guide their mother had marked with penciled stars beside tide pool pages. They sat cross-legged on the rug, trading memories like shells and agreeing to leave blanks where certainty would be unkind. He spoke about a trust that would never dictate, only offer. She asked how to shape grants toward girls who arrive with no files and boys who pretend they don't need help. He listened, as if she were already a director. Relief and fear braided inside her, two strands pulling one rope. Before sleep, she stood again at the window. The moon slid out of gauze and painted a road on black water. She tapped the crescent against the glass, then held it to her lips, honoring the child who had carried it through rooms that smelled of bleach and weary compromise. Behind her, the house breathed. Ahead, the cliff held. Below, the Pacific kept time. Darkness settled, not as a threat, but as a space. Identity did not arrive like a new outfit. It gathered like weather until even names changed shape. In that hush, she realized she could be both Lila, who survived, and Alina, who returned. A person stitched from tide and sky, choosing instead of begging. What would it feel like to discover your entire life was a lie? Morning fog pulled back from the headlands like a slow curtain, and a pale band of sun slid along the water while Alina tied her hair and buttoned the moss sweater Clara had pressed into her hands. Ethan waited by the terrace rail, ring catching, light, voice low, ready, not to rush her, but to share the moment. And together they drove toward town as waves breathed against basalt and gulls drifted above the bluff road. At the marina, Ray met them with a folder fat with documents and the calm of someone who carries proof, not rumor. The sapphire crest gleamed as if nothing could stain it, yet the lobby buzzed with quiet nerves. The board had been called into a special session, and the chair glanced at Ethan with a gratitude that bordered on relief. Margaret arrived in a cream coat, pearls steady along her throat, smile polished to a hard shine. She greeted donors as if stepping onto a stage, then swept into the conference room without looking toward the servers who had watched her rise on polished stories. Doors shut, chairs scraped. Ray set the folder on the table and opened it to a replica invoice from a theatrical jeweler dated 1 week before the gala, followed by a loan schedule that stacked interest like storm swells, followed by call logs, placing whispered warnings to managers across town minutes after the false alarm. Tomas's statement, signed and witnessed, lay on top of a photo of the plated ring he had pulled from the pastry bin, a close shot of a tiny CZ etched inside the shank. Conversation thinned to breath. Margaret kept her chin high and called it a clerical mix-up, then blamed an assistant, then claimed a coincidence so rare it sounded like fiction. Ray turned pages without hurry, each a tide advancing, and laid down texts from Margaret's direct line, time-stamped calls to the agency, a list of names blocked before dishes from the spill had even cooled. Ethan did not raise his voice, spoke plainly about what the room already knew. A young worker had been humiliated in public, stripped of income, and shadowed by a whisper chain because a patron needed spectacle to hold together a fragile image. He let the sentence hang and watched faces reckon with their part in a performance that had become policy. Evening light drifted across the cliff house in slow gold as Alina learned the rhythms of a life no longer tied to alarms or bus routes. She rose before sunrise, opened windows for salt and cedar, brewed strong coffee, walked the terrace barefoot to watch swells fold over basalt. Photographs from the wooden box lay across the table like windows that finally opened. She and Ethan picked one and spoke until the image felt alive, their mother sketching tide pool maps in pencil, their father teaching knots with patient hands, a crooked cake with a sugar moon sliding while 2 children laughed at the sweet collapse. When words thinned, they let quiet carry the rest, the ocean beating time below. On the 3rd morning, she followed a path down the bluff and named aloud the things that were hers now, so the cliff might keep them. A brother, a history work she could shape, a home that did not erase yesterday. She stopped at Harbor Haven, with forms for ID grants and notes for a calmer intake, then drove back with fruit that would become dessert after stew. Ethan had already turned the foundation toward long projects, yet he insisted she draft the plan she most wanted. At the kitchen island, they wrote rules on butcher paper, fund lost documents, sustain beds between storms, train volunteers to listen, build escape valves, so Mercy never needs a meeting. She printed the draft with her name and his beside it. Like bearings on a chart, afternoons meant the headland trail, even when drizzle stitched the ferns, letting their steps learn the coast's patience. Down the slope, surfers dotted the break. Beyond, trawlers nudged the gray and returned with stories as heavy as nets. Each evening, the house held more light than one sun seemed able to make. She kept the crescent at her throat and set Ethan's ring on the table while they worked, metal touching metal, a quiet pledge that nothing would be misplaced again. Clara visited when the fog burned away. They ate chowder on the terrace and shouted with joy when a whale lifted like a hill and slipped under, leaving a ring of foam where the world had opened. She left a note on the fridge leaf space for wonder and promised to sleep over weekly until unlearning scarcity stopped feeling like a test. Alina breathed easier after that, the way a chest loosens when a friend walks in. Ethan met with attorneys and auditors, yet he always returned to cook something that tasted of memory. While onions softened, he told stories about parents who built routines around weather and believed any map could be redrawn when a coast shifted. She listened with her hands around a warm bowl, storing each detail like a shell in a pocket. Created a shelf labeled us, a field guide with penciled stars. Sand from the cove, a pressed foxglove. The program from the shelter's vote approving her grant, and the photograph that broke the lock between past and present. Days leaned toward service. She still pulled morning shifts at Harbor Haven, never announcing her surname, just tying an apron and giving steadiness where needed. Margaret came every Saturday, sleeves rolled, learning that humility has a rhythm hands remember when pride stops shouting. They spoke only as co-workers, one asking for bowls or towels, the other answering without ornaments. When gossip rose in the alley, Alina found a broom because work beats rumor. Liked the new manager at the Sapphire Crest, a woman who wrote fairness into procedure and matched it with raises that did not demand applause. Tomas moved to the grill and trained new hires on emergency grace. Mr. Grayson called to apologize. She wished him well and set the call down like a stone she no longer needed to carry. In quiet hours, Alina walked through rooms that once felt like a museum and let them become ordinary. She planted rosemary in a clay pot, taped her blue window, seat to the fridge, and learned which stair creaked on the run for tea. Letters from their mother spoke of rescues, science fairs, and a child who stacked rocks until towers fell, laughing at the tumble as much as the build. Alina found herself in those lines, even when names were scarce. Sometimes she slid the necklace free and set it beside Ethan's band on the sill so evening could paint both in the same color. The light click when they touched always warmed the room. On a clear Saturday, they drove south to a calmer bay where a small house waited, the deed stamped years earlier, in a folder that carried careful promises. They measured for repair, walked the beach until dogs raced their shadows, and ate oysters at a mint-painted shack. Child brought a pebble shaped like a moon. She tucked it into a pocket for luck. Being known shifted from risk to welcome. That evening, they stopped at the memorial pier where a plaque had carried her name among lost sailors for years. They stood with hats off while the harbor breathed. She touched the metal and did not feel erased. Ethan asked the harbor office to move the inscription to another panel with a line noting that some returns arrive on their tides, and the clerk promised to handle it gently. When rain returned, it felt like a blessing. They worked by wide windows while the Pacific wrote its endless essay against the cliffs. She reviewed a voucher pilot for hotel nights during floods and marked questions about fees and transport. He grew the rescue grant without starving smaller projects. Every decision seemed to reach back and steady a younger version of both of them. At dusk, they walked the headland path through spruce as mist slid between trunks and surf beat a pulse underfoot. They talked about work, fear, gratitude, and the shape of a family that would stay honest even when storms took the roof. She said she wanted to pilot a small boat again. Said he knew a patient teacher. Lessons began on water as calm as hammered tin. She learned throttle patience, bowlines, and how tide tables hide surprises. The first time the skiff kissed. A wave wrong, she laughed, corrected, and tried again. One golden evening delivered the chapter they needed. Clouds lifted like curtains to reveal a sky rinsed clean. They carried thermoses and a blanket to the wide sand north of the lighthouse, leaving shoes by the drift line. Children chased plovers. A couple built a modest fire. A dog trotted by with a kelp rope like a prize. Asun leaned toward the rim of the world and turned the water to copper. Ethan slipped the ring onto his finger. She raised the crescent so that low light filled it like a young moon. They touched metal together and pressed both pieces to their hearts, anchoring a promise spoken softly between them. Neither pretended that life would accept neat chapters. They only agreed to stand side by side when maps blurred, to ask questions loud enough to keep pride from blinding them, and to choose work that left more shelter than harm. Waves ran their glittering relay toward shore, each spending itself, and giving room to the next. When the sun reached the line, the world paused. Headlands darkened to silhouettes, the horizon caught fire, and thin clouds blushed like sails. A breeze moved across the beach, smelling of salt, wood smoke, and distant rain. Ethan offered his arm, and she took it, not out of need but as a sign. That family can be found deliberately. They walked the tide line while evening braided violet into amber, leaving prints that filled with water and faded, replaced by new steps. Home felt like that. Not a fixed point, but a path chosen with someone who sees you and stays. Past the point, the lighthouse swung its patient beam. Behind them, the house waited with windows like lanterns. In front, the Pacific breathed in. Slow strokes. Alina closed her eyes and heard, as clearly as the first time, the phrase that carried her across foster rooms and night buses. Kitchens and cots, all the way to this shoreline where metal remembered its twin and a name returned. To its owner, she whispered it once without translation and let it stand, then opened her eyes to color that made promises believable. If this story of loss, hope, and reunion touched you, hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs hope and comment. What's your anchor in tough times?